All Quiet on the Western Front follows Paul Baumer, a young German soldier, and his squad mates through the horrors of World War One. Chapter 1 begins with Paul and his second company returning from the front with only 80 men out of 150. Paul and his comrades enjoyed extra proportions upon their arrival. Food was arguably the most valuable thing amongst soldiers like them. After facing the harsh realities of war, Paul and his squad mates learn that it is not as glorious as their schoolmaster Kantorek had described it. He calls them the Iron Youth when he congratulates them for enlisting. However, Paul and his classmates feel that they are no longer young. War and its hardships has taken their youth from them. As well as taking their youth, war takes one of Paul's comrades, Kemmerich, whose leg was fatally injured in battle. In his last hours of life, all of Paul's group went to see him in the hospital. It was a very painful experience. With all this death around him, memories of life before the war haunt Paul. He feels as though he would not know what to do if he were to be given back his old life. War is all he has now. When new recruits arrive, Paul feels like a veteran with his squad mates. The new recruits are so innocent and unable to defend themselves. After seeing how vulnerable the recruits were, Paul is almost thankful for the harsh training his corporal Himmelstoss put him through. However, some of his worst techniques, like making the bedwetters share the same bunk, push Paul and his squad to get their revenge on him in a night attack. Soon Paul finds himself back on the front and has to face the worst parts of war once more. When a French bombardment begins, matters get even worse. The recruits are losing it, and the resolve of the second company is dropping drastically. Eventually, the shelling ceases, and the group is forced into retreat. They encounter another battle at the graveyard. It symbolizes death, and death is all around them once more.
In the beginning of Chapter 5, Paul and his squad mates discuss what they would do should the war end soon. Most of them fantasize about getting drunk and chasing after women, except for Kat, who would return home to his wife and children. This section allows us to see what the soldiers think about when they are stranded in their living hell. Kropp, being a pessimist, does not believe that the war will ever end. Despite Kropp being the only one to openly declare his thought, the rest of the soldiers believe this as well, because unlike Kat, they did not have a structured life prior to the war. They were just kids in school who got caught up in the false glory of war. Later in the chapter, the squad encounters Himmelstoss, the cruel, sadistic corporal in charge of them at boot camp. Some of the squad members had previously assaulted Himmelstoss, and Himmelstoss arrives at their camp and orders Hayden to respect him as his superior officer. Hayden refuses and is threatened to be court-martialed, which does not worry him, because he sees time in military prison as time away from the front. Hayden and Kropp are eventually court-martialed after hiding from Himmelstoss for some time. They receive light punishments of a few days in military prison after the stories of Himmelstoss's cruelty are told to the acting judge. Kat and Paul then find a couple of geese and take one back for a meal. They bring some of it back to the prison where Hayden and Kropp are being held. This part shows the strong bond of camaraderie between the soldiers, because even though goose is probably a rare meal for them, Kat and Paul are kind enough to bring some to Hayden and Kropp rather than eating it themselves, something that they would most likely not do for people with whom they had a lesser bond. In Chapter 6, the war is shown to be going very badly for Paul and his squad. They are being constantly bombarded by enemy shells with no end in sight. This lowers the already pathetic level of morale. During these bombardments, some of the new recruits who have just arrived go crazy with fear and try to escape. One does and is almost immediately blown to bits. These traumatic experiences cause Paul to reflect on himself, and he feels as though he has no reason to live and is indifferent about dying. Many recruits have died during battle and Haye is killed. Only 32 of the 150 original men are still alive. In Chapter 7 of the novel, Paul is given a leave to go visit his home and his mother. While there, a major from the army shows up on the street and yells at Paul to salute him. He makes Paul back up, march him, and salute. This greatly embarrasses Paul, who then decides just to wear street clothes around while he is on leave. Meanwhile at home, Paul's mother has cancer and is sick in bed. At the end of the chapter, Paul's doubts about whether he should have gone on leave because he realizes that probably everything he has will eventually be gone and that his home is now the front. His despair sets in and he couldn't enjoy his leave. In chapter 8, Paul talks a lot about the camp that surrounds theirs, that is filled with Russian prisoners of war. He talks about the people by saying how pathetic they are, how they go around the soldiers' camp looking for scraps of food in the trash and eating it. They are horribly mistreated and are often ignored and kicked by German soldiers and guards. However, the brotherhood between all the Russian soldiers touches Paul, and he marvels at how miserable they are, yet they all cooperate with each other and never fight. Before Paul goes back to the front, his sister and father come to visit him. However, the only thing they can find to talk about is his mother's illness and how she is doing. She is in the hospital and being treated. This visit turns out to be just as awkward as his visit to his mother at home.
In chapter 9, Paul goes back to the front and is greeted by the news that the Kaiser of Germany is paying a visit to the army. In preparation, the soldiers are given new clothes and are clean, but when the Kaiser arrives, the army is surprised to see that the Kaiser is not very Kaiser-like, and when he leaves, he does not leave a great impression on the soldiers. During a battle, Paul volunteers to crawl into no man's land to gather enemy information, but during the battle, Paul is forced to pretend that he is dead and lie in a ditch because an attack is underway. While he's in a trench, he stabs and kills an enemy soldier. While he's still there, he expresses his guilt to the soldier's body and finds out his name and info. He feels extremely guilty and sends money to the family anonymously. Paul and his squad are assigned to an abandoned supply dump where they live a glorious life with massive feasts, cushioned beds, and even a pet stray cat. After 3 glorious weeks, the squad is moved to evacuate another village, but when the village comes under attack by shells, Paul and Krop are tragically wounded by a falling artillery. Paul and Krop are rushed to a hospital, but Krop's wound is too big for him to handle, so his leg is amputated at the thigh. At the Catholic hospital, the boys meet up with a man named Lewandowski, who is at the hospital for a stomach injury. He tells the men about how excited he is that his wife is coming to visit, and the boys feel a longing for their family as well. Paul is told to go home until he is healed, and Paul is happy at first, but leaving his mother for a second time is one of Paul's hardest tasks, for she is becoming old and weak. Later in the story, Mueller is shot in the abdomen and suffers 30 minutes before he dies. The brutality of Mueller's death shows the bloodiness and overall horror of the war. One day, Paul's best friend, Kat, is wounded while looking for food. Paul cannot leave to find help because of Kat's state, so he carries him to safety, with shells falling around him. When Kat finally reaches safety, Paul lays him down to find that Kat was hit in the head with a fragment. Paul's only and best friend is dead. Soon after Kat's death, Paul is fatally wounded by gunshots in an unordinarily peaceful day, and the army report reads only, "All quiet on the Western Front." And as Paul dies, his face is calm, as though almost glad the end has come.